The Greek contribution to ancient Mesopotamian culture is enormous. With the rise of Greek civilization on the Peloponnesian Peninsula, a whole new approach to the interpretation of the human body was instituted. The human figure had been the subject of art since the earliest civilizations. In the art of adjacent cultures like ancient Egypt, artists, with a few exceptions, depicted animals with naturalism and sensitivity. However, they often painted and sculpted the human figure in a way that was far from realistic. It was more symbolic, abstract, and stylized, as if humanity was removed from the natural world. Beginning in the early Archaic period of the 7th century through the Hellenistic era after the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek artists developed increasingly naturalistic representations of the human figure. This new approach was rooted in the concept of humanism, a worldview that centered man's importance in the world, stressing concepts such as civic duty and self-improvement. The Greeks believed that improving oneself physically and mentally was not only a benefit to society, but also a sign of goodness. Therefore, the Greeks celebrated the centrality of man by developing ways to depict the human body in more and more realistic manners. Likewise, the Greeks wanted to celebrate the perfection of the human form. Unlike many early civilizations where nudity was associated with shame, vulnerability, or defeat, the Greeks embraced the nude body as an ideal, especially the male nude as a symbol of strength, beauty, reason, and moral excellence. This artistic shift reflected this broader philosophy of humanism, which placed human beings at the center of intellectual and moral concern. The earliest Greek art was heavily influenced by its Mediterranean and Mesopotamian neighbors. In the 7th century BCE, in a period we call the Archaic, Greek art begins to diverge from this influence with new visual and stylistic conventions that begin to differentiate Greek visual culture from its older, influential neighbors. One of the earliest examples of the Greek interest in the human body is the Anavysos Kouros. Like many Kouroi, that's plural for chorus, this statue stands in a rigid frontal pose, arms at its side with one foot slightly forward. The similarities between early Greek Kouroi and Egyptian statues is no coincidence. Greece's proximity to Egypt meant that trade, travel, and cultural exchange were common. Egyptian sculpture, especially figures of pharaohs and priests, often showed the human body in a highly idealized frontal pose, with the left foot stepping forward. The chorus figure borrows that stance. But there are two key differences that reflect the beginnings of something new. First, the eyes tend to bulge slightly, and second, the lips curve into what we now call the archaic smile. These aren't realistic features, but they attempt something radical for their time, the expression of emotion, awareness, and individuality. The archaic smile doesn't convey happiness so much as liveliness. It tells us that this figure is not a god. It's not a rigid icon, but a being with presence and inner life. This was a huge shift. While other ancient cultures often used stylized figures to communicate divine power or symbolic authority, the Greeks were starting to show interest in the individual, the human experience, and the idea that the body could reflect the soul. They didn't quite get it right. Emotions still looked stiff and formulaic, but they were on their way. Kouroi served several functions. Some stood as grave markers for fallen youth. The Anavysos chorus, for instance, was made to commemorate a young soldier named Kritios who died in battle. This statue was placed over his grave. Others were dedicated as offerings in sanctuaries. These statues may not have always represented individuals, but they did express ideals, strength, beauty, vitality. One of the most radical aspects of the Kouros is its nudity. While most nearby cultures reserved nudity for slaves, defeated enemies, or figures meant to evoke shame and vulnerability, the Greeks embraced the nude human form. For them, the nude male body, especially the athletic body, was an ideal. The nude wasn't just acceptable, it was noble. The idea is that excellence, be it physical, mental, or moral, requires hard work and dedication. The beautiful body was a symbol of one's character and the ability to strive and excel. To look good was to be good in ancient Greece. Female statues from the Archaic period are known as Korai, plural of kor. And while they share the frontal pose and formal symmetry of the Kouros, they follow a different set of rules. Here we have the peplos kor, draped in a richly patterned garment, a peplos, and you'll notice immediately that she differs from her male Kouros counterpart in that she is clothed rather than nude, reflecting the cultural expectation that respectable women be modest. Still, like her male counterpart, she stands upright, smiles faintly, and looks directly at the viewer. Scholars once assumed she represented a mortal girl, but now many believe that she may depict a goddess, based on the holes around her head, which once held a metal crown or headdress. Though more modest in appearance, the peplos kor still expresses the archaic Greek interest in vitality, beauty, and presence. Even if the female figure remained more restricted in physical expression compared to the celebratory nudity of the male Kouros. Greek marble sculptures were originally painted in bright, sometimes even garish colors. This is known as polychromy, or a polychrome statue, which is just a fancy way of saying many colors. Over time, the paint wore away, and later archaeologists, often steeped in neoclassical ideals of purity and whiteness, mistakenly assumed that the figures were always meant to be pristine and unpainted. Some even scrubbed away remaining pigment during restoration. What we now know is that these statues once looked far more vivid, expressive, and alive, just like the culture that made them. The early classical period represents a turning point for Greek sculpture. Greece, especially Athens, had just emerged victorious from the Persian Wars in a series of battles in which a coalition of Greek city-states held off the massive Persian Empire, and the psychological effect was huge. A small divided group of Greek city-states had put aside their differences, for the moment at least, and defeated the largest empire in the world, twice within a 10-year period. Athens in particular claimed much of the glory and soon positioned itself as the intellectual, political, and cultural leader of the Greek world. This marked the beginning of what would become Athens' Golden Age, a time of immense creativity, architectural achievement, and philosophical inquiry. Art changed too. The rigid, idealized figures of the Archaic period gave way to something more subtle and alive. The Kritios Boy, named after the sculptor Kritios, although he may or may not have been the actual creator of this work, marks this turning point. For the first time, we see a figure that truly stands like a human being. His hips shift, his knees bend, and his weight rests naturally on one leg. This is the first known example of contrapposto, or counterbalance, a relaxed pose that introduces movement and potential energy into the figure. The Kritios Boy also departs from the exaggerated features of the Archaic period. Gone are the bulging eyes and the goofy, stylized archaic smile. The expression is neutral, almost introspective. This is humanism taking root. Greek artists were beginning to study the body not just as a surface, but as an anatomical structure. They wanted to understand how people move, how they shift their weight, and how that reflects their mental state. The body became a reflection of the mind. The sculpture is also a celebration of physical beauty and athletic excellence. The figure is young, lean, strong, showing off not just anatomical accuracy, but an idealized version of the male body. In Greek culture, especially in Athens, physical training was tied to moral and civic virtue. Athleticism was not only admired, it was considered a reflection of inner discipline. The Kritios Boy is not a portrait of an individual, he is a vision of what a young citizen should be. Graceful, self-controlled, and fully human in both body and mind. Athens' newfound power gave its citizens a renewed faith in reason, the individual, and the potential of the human mind and body. This philosophy is reflected in their art. Figures are no longer anonymous ideals, but they feel like people. And that push towards an idealized realism will drive Greek artists to even further innovations. The High Classical period represents the peak of Greek confidence in human reason, order, and potential. Following Athens' rise to power in the wake of the Persian Wars, the city entered its Golden Age under its leader Pericles. This was the age of the Parthenon, of Socrates and Sophocles, of democracy. It was a time when the Greeks, especially the Athenians, believed that through logic, balance, discipline, human beings could achieve greatness intellectually, physically, and ethically. Polykleitos Doryphoros, or the spear bearer, is the definitive embodiment of this ideal. The statue presents a perfectly proportioned male athlete in full contrapposto, relaxed, confident, and in total control of his body. Polykleitos intended this artwork to serve as a kind of template of perfection. Although we call it the Doryphoros, it was originally known as the Canon. A canon is a set of rules or standards, and Polykleitos' canon was meant to serve as a definitive guide for representing the ideal human form. But this sculpture represents more than just physical strength. It symbolizes inner balance and composure. If we look at the figure's face, we don't see the beautiful but slightly vacant expression of the Kritios Boy, but rather the thoughtful, focused countenance of a grown man in full command of himself, emotionally, physically, morally. And like the Kritios Boy, the Doryphoros is nude, but here that nudity has evolved into something even more idealized. It's not just a celebration of athleticism. The beautiful body reflects a beautiful soul. To sculpt the perfect male form was to sculpt the highest version of human nature. The Greeks were not simply trying to represent the human body as it was, but as it ought to be, its ideal best. Keep in mind also that we are seeing a Roman copy of the lost Greek original. The Romans were great connoisseurs of Greek art. The original Greek sculptures were often made in the more expensive and durable bronze. However, Roman artists often used marble when making copies due to it being less costly. However, marble is far more fragile than bronze, hence the missing limbs and appendages on so many ancient statues. This golden age of prosperity and innovation was marred by inner turmoil, as the bitter conflict called the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta left much of Greece politically fractured and weakened. In the power vacuum that followed, Greece was conquered by the rising kingdom of Macedon. Under the leadership of Alexander the Great, Macedon united the Greek city-states and then launched an ambitious campaign of conquest that would stretch from Egypt to India. In doing so, Alexander spread Greek language, art, and philosophy across a vast multicultural empire and ushered in the transformation from the classical to the Hellenistic age. And as the political landscape changed, so did the art. The calm, timeless perfection of the High Classical period gave way to a growing interest in emotion, movement, and the uniqueness of the individual. Artists of the Late Classical period no longer sought to represent a universal ideal. They became increasingly focused on how real people looked, moved, and felt. Lysippos, the favorite sculptor of Alexander the Great, helped define this new approach. One of his best-known works, the Apoxyomenos, shows an athlete in the act of scraping oil and sweat from his body with a small metal tool called a strigil. The pose breaks from the self-contained frontal compositions of earlier periods. The figure's outstretched arms juts into the viewer's space, and his turned head implies movement and awareness of the surrounding world. This is a body in motion. This is less about harmony and more about creating dynamic movement. Lysippos also altered the proportions of the human figure. His statues are more slender, with smaller heads and longer limbs, giving them a heightened sense of elegance and fluidity. These changes weren't just aesthetic. They reflected a different way of thinking about the human body. Instead of representing a stable archetype, artists were now using the human form as a device for emotional expression. There is something personal and relatable in the Apoxyomenos. He's not performing heroics or embodying abstract ideals. He's just cleaning himself after exercise. But in this everyday action, we see a much more intimate view of humanity. This is not the perfect idealism of the High Classical period, but a celebration of the mundane beauty of everyday life. One of the most significant developments of the late classical period was the introduction of the fully nude female figure into public monumental art. The female nude had existed in private erotic imagery throughout the history of the Greek world, but this is the first time it appeared in public sculpture intended for communal or sacred spaces, not private consumption. Until now, respectable women in Greek art, like the Peplos core, had been shown clothed, modest, and contained. But that changed with Praxiteles Aphrodite of Knidos, the first large-scale sculpture of a goddess completely nude. This wasn't just a technical achievement, it marked a major cultural shift. For the first time, the female body was treated not just with reverence, but with sensuality. The figure is idealized, but she is also sexualized. She covers herself in a modest gesture that paradoxically draws attention to her nudity. Viewers were meant to admire her, to be moved by her beauty, and yes, to desire her. This was a different kind of humanism, one that introduced eroticism as part of the human experience. Female nudity was no longer reserved for mythical victims or degraded figures. Instead, divinity and desire were now linked. The Aphrodite of Knidos was so admired in antiquity that it became a tourist attraction. Some accounts even claim it inspired romantic obsession. What had once been off limits was now central to how the human form, male and female, could be understood, not only as strong, virtuous, or wise, but as sensual, vulnerable, emotionally complex. The late classical period didn't reject humanism, it expanded it. Artists became less concerned with eternal perfection and more interested in the complexity of human experience. The gods looked more human. The heroes showed more emotion. And sculpture began to suggest that being human wasn't just about ideal form, it was about thought, movement, individuality. The death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE marks the start of the Hellenistic period, a time of enormous cultural expansion, political fragmentation, and artistic experimentation. Alexander's vast empire fractured into rival kingdoms, and Greek culture mingled with the languages, beliefs, and artistic traditions of Egypt, Persia, and the wider Mediterranean. This diversity and the instability that came with it was reflected in the art. Hellenistic sculpture pushed beyond the ideals of classical beauty and balance to explore a much wider range of human experiences: pain, aging, vulnerability, desire, psychological depth. Hellenistic art is human, but not necessarily humanistic in the same idealizing sense as before. It no longer viewed humanity as a perfect creation, but instead celebrated the highs and lows, the successes and failures, the fears and desires of a complicated species. From the hunched figure of an old alcoholic woman wandering the agora to the explicitly erotic hedonism of the Barberini faun, Hellenistic artists were unafraid to explore extremes of the human condition. And one of the most powerful examples is the Dying Gaul. Here, a Roman copy of a Greek original that shows a defeated enemy warrior in his final moments. He is wounded, naked, and slumped forward, bracing himself with one arm while his hand sinks towards the ground. The Gauls were a Celtic tribe from northern Europe who posed a serious military threat to the Greek world during the 3rd century BCE. The kingdom of Pergamon, located in Asia Minor, one of the remnants of Alexander's empire, fought a major campaign to repel invading Gallic forces. The Dying Gaul was part of a sculptural monument commissioned to commemorate Pergamon's victory over these invaders. And yet, despite being an enemy, the Gaul is portrayed with extraordinary pathos and respect. He is not demonized or caricatured. Instead, he is shown in the fullness of his humanity, strong, suffering, deeply dignified. This foreign enemy is treated with the kind of admiration and empathy all human beings long for. It is a reminder that even those outside the boundaries of the Greek world, those once seen as barbarians, could be recognized as noble in defeat. This sculpture is both brutal and deeply humane. The Gaul is not a Greek hero, not a god, and not an idealized athlete. He's a foreigner, a defeated warrior, but he is treated with even admiration. His suffering is real, and we are meant to feel it. His body is muscular, heavy with exhaustion. His face is full of pain, but also defiance. This is a man who is facing his own mortality, and yet in those final remaining moments, he struggles to remain alive. He fights against the darkness, knowing that he will ultimately fail, but knowing that he doesn't have a choice but to do so anyway. This is a picture of empathy. We, the viewers, share this man's pain, his loss, and the loneliness of his rapidly approaching death. In works like this, Hellenistic artists made emotional engagement central to their art. They showed twisted bodies in agony, elderly figures with sagging skin, and children playing or crying, and gods caught in moments of vulnerability. The human figure remained important, but it was no longer used to express abstract ideals of balance and order. Instead, it became a way to explore drama, complexity, the rawness of life. Humanism doesn't fully disappear, it transforms. The body could be broken, the face could show pain, even outsiders and enemies could be fully human. The Hellenistic period closes this long art in Greek art not with a return to mythic perfection, but with a fuller, deeper portrayal of what it means to be alive. Over the course of 5 centuries, Greek sculpture evolved from rigid, symbolic forms to deeply naturalistic and emotionally resonant figures. What remained constant was the central focus on the human body, not simply as a study in anatomy, but as a vehicle for expressing thought, movement, emotion, identity. From the youthful stillness of the Anavysos Kouros to the weary dignity of the Dying Gaul, Greek artists used the figure to explore what it means to be human. Humanism as it emerged in Greek art was never static, never still. It began with the pursuit of ideal beauty, moral virtue, and expanded to include pain, sensuality, vulnerability, psychological depth. From the ideal to the very, very real. Thank you very much for joining me, and remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you in the next video.